The OKC Thunder were literally one win away from making it back to the NBA Finals this year, despite the fact that they were missing two of their best shot creators in J-Dub and AJ Mitchell, which is why, as a Thunder fan, coming to terms with how they lost to the San Antonio Spurs was actually quite easy for me. But I think what actually made their defeat in the conference finals so devastating was the fact that this was actually the Thunder's last cheap season. Looking at it, when OKC won the championship last year, they only had the 19th highest payroll in the entire league. Then, as defending champions this year, their payroll also only ranked the 13th highest in the entire NBA. But next season, with the max extensions of J-Dub and Chet starting to kick in, assuming they keep all their current players and exercise all existing team options, the Thunder's payroll is projected to be the highest in the entire NBA at $246 million, which amount is already $24 million above the second apron threshold. And that's without even taking into account the two potential first-round selections they will have in this year's draft. But then, if you take into account the salaries of whoever they will potentially select with those two picks, the Thunder's payroll balloons to an even bigger $261 million, which will put them $39 million above the second apron threshold. In addition, beginning next season, OKC will also become a luxury tax team for the first time in 7 years, and as a result, the Thunder will possibly be spending a league record $500 million in combined salaries and tax penalties just for the 2026 to 2027 season alone. And things will only get more expensive from there, as in the 2027 to 2028 season, SGA's Supermax contract as well as Cason Wallace's potential extension will also be kicking in. Well, what's for sure is that the collective bargaining agreement and its second apron eventually comes for everyone. In fact, the last two NBA champions before OKC, the Denver Nuggets and the Boston Celtics, both had to make massive roster-altering decisions right after winning the championship just to avoid entering second apron territory. Denver had to let go of Bruce Brown and Jeff Green immediately after winning the title, and while Boston was able to keep their championship core at least for one more year, they still ended up trading both Drew Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis, while also being forced to let Al Horford and Luke Cornett walk one summer later. But to be fair, OKC spent years preparing for this moment. Compared to those recent champions, the Thunder are actually better insulated against potential second apron limitations than any team could be, as their stockpile of future draft assets will allow them to replace expensive core players with cheap rookie-scale contracts. But still, that doesn't mean the Thunder won't have to make big decisions this offseason, especially if the goal is to duck the second apron at least for one more year. So given OKC's financial situation, the big questions are, who's gonna get cut from the roster this offseason? And further, do the Thunder even have to take more extreme steps in terms of roster building, such as trying to trade up within the top 3 of this year's draft, or even trying to pull off a trade for Giannis Antetokounmpo? But before we dive any deeper, let's first answer one important question, and that is, what if the Thunder don't make roster moves this offseason, just keep the whole team together and just straight up embrace being a second apron team? Will that unofficially put OKC in the hard cap? Well, I think the answer is it doesn't have to. First off, most of the penalties given to second apron teams relate to adding players externally. For instance, second apron teams can't aggregate 2 or more players to match salaries in a trade, they can't use any portion of the mid-level exception to sign players, and they can't send out cash as part of any player deal. But the thing is, OKC most likely don't really need to add any big-name players externally, as they've already won the title with this current roster as presently constructed. But for sure, second apron teams will also have to face penalties involving draft picks. For instance, when a team falls under the second apron, their first-round draft picks 7 years into the future can't be used or traded. And also, once a team remains in the second apron for 3 out of 5 consecutive seasons, their first-round draft pick automatically falls to the very end of the first round. But then again, the Thunder have accumulated such a surplus of future draft assets, and they also have so many paths to adding more picks in the future, which is why all those draft penalties just might not even hurt them that badly. But nonetheless, we should still expect the Thunder to treat the second apron as a hard cap entering next season, and that's because of what's coming a few years down the line. As it appears, the current collective bargaining agreement will most likely change in 3 years because it has an opt-out clause after the 2028 to 2029 season. So for the Thunder, what they're basically facing here is uncertainty, as there's no way to tell if the new CBA will be more lenient or probably more harsh in terms of the penalties it will impose to second apron teams. which is why the most reasonable option here for the Thunder is still to try and duck the second apron as much as they can and just hope that the next CBA changes in a way that's more favorable to them than this current one. And realistically speaking, given their roster situation, the Thunder can still actually duck the second apron for at least one more year. But of course, that will all depend on how they will trim down their massive payroll heading into next season. Which brings us to the next question. Who will OKC let go this offseason, aka who's actually replaceable? Well, to me, there are three quite obvious answers. First, there's Isaiah Joe. He's set to make a reasonable $22.6 million over the next 2 years, but Jared McCain, who's gonna make a cheaper $11.1 million over the next 2 seasons, has already played far more than Joe did in this year's playoffs. And McCain's already shown that he's capable of replacing Joe as a designated shooter in OKC's rotation while also having a higher offensive ceiling. Also, the Thunder won't have any trouble trading Joe into another team's mid-level exception given his cheap contract, which even includes an $11.3 million team option for the 2027 to 2028 season. Next, there's Aaron Wiggins, who's on another team-friendly contract. He's gonna make just $8.8 million next season, with even cheaper numbers for the 2 seasons after that. Wiggins has been stuck in OKC's bench in the playoffs, but is definitely a rotation caliber player who's even possibly gonna be a starter on another team. Trading Wiggins should also possibly clear OKC's perimeter rotation to accommodate some minutes for former lottery pick Nikola Topic, who's expected to get more playing time for OKC next season. Then lastly, there's Lou Dort, who has an $18.2 million team option for next season. Well, Dort's on-ball defense is still one of the best in the entire NBA, but his offense has become a real weakness, especially in a playoff setting. Well, the only problem is there aren't many teams positioned to take on Dort's contract in a trade because he's making more than the mid-level exception, and OKC's preference is most likely to keep him away from the Lakers, who would have the cap space to outright sign him if his team option is declined, because obviously, the last thing OKC would want to see is Dort defending Shai in a playoff series next year, which I think means OKC will most likely explore trades with teams like the Celtics, Bulls, Mavs, or Grizzlies who either have big cap space or own big trade exceptions. So all in all, offloading the salaries of Joe, Wiggins, and Dort would leave the Thunder with 14 roster spots filled, and most importantly, it would put them slightly below the second apron threshold for next season. But I don't expect the Thunder to stop there, as they will likely want to find more savings both for long-term planning and for more flexibility to possibly go after some depth pieces, whether this offseason or during the trade deadline if needed. With regard to that, I think there are 3 more situations that we should be watching. First, there's the iHeart situation with his $28.5 million team option for next season. Well, sure, the Thunder have Jay Will as a reliable backup big, and they still have to see what they have in Thomas Sorber as a potential long-term frontcourt piece. Nonetheless, iHeart is still unquestionably irreplaceable in OKC's current roster construction. Over the last 2 years, OKC has had a 115-27 win-loss record in the games that iHeart's played, and with him on the floor, the Thunder were plus 15 during the last 2 regular seasons, and they were also a plus 10 with him on the court during the last 2 postseasons. Well, the Thunder simply struggle to get offensive rebounds when iHeart's not on the floor, and he also ranks among the top of the NBA in terms of screen assists, which is a critical stat for enabling Shai's drives in the paint. In addition, iHeart's physicality was essential against Wembanyama in the conference finals, and his signature push shot is also one of the very few shots in basketball that evades Wemby's paint defense. It's just hard to imagine OKC letting iHeart go at this point, especially heading into next season's redemption campaign. So I think the odds are OKC will work with him on a long-term extension that will probably lower his value for next season a bit, but will be balanced by locking him up on a long-term deal, which I think could look something like a 3-year extension worth $66 million. Another contract situation involves that of Kenrich Williams, who has a cheaper $7.2 million team option for next season. Well, Williams doesn't play much, but that's not a matter of quality. In fact, Kenrich would definitely be playing on most other teams. He's a solid locker room figure as well as a very reliable insurance depth piece for the Thunder off the bench, who averaged 8.2 points and 4 rebounds in the 37 games he played this season. Well, sure, OKC could just let him walk to open up a roster spot, but I think it's also very possible they decline his team option, but only for them to re-sign him to a new multi-year contract, provided it's at a really low figure. Another situation the Thunder will have to address pertains to their draft selections this year. Well, ideally, OKC would not prefer to use both the number 12 and the number 17 picks because they most likely won't have minutes to spare for multiple rookies next season. So I think a possible option here is to trade one or both of those first rounders in exchange for future draft picks, possibly selections during during the 2029 or 2030 drafts, because beginning in the 2029 NBA draft, the only picks that the Thunder will have are their own first-rounders, and keeping more draft assets as further into the future as possible will be important for OKC if they ever want to make an aggressive move for a specific draft prospect a few years down the line. So this is what's basically on the table for the Thunder this offseason. I imagine Dort, Joe, and Wiggins, or at least two of them, to be traded. Meanwhile, iHeart should be back on a new deal, and the Thunder probably won't use both of their first-round selections in the draft. The thing is, those outcomes are already somehow expected, but what if the Thunder actually took more extreme steps in terms of roster building this offseason? Well, there's been plenty of speculation about the Thunder potentially trying to trade up in this year's draft, with Duke's Cameron Boozer most frequently cited as OKC's target. And sure, just as I talked about in the video I made late last year, I believe Boozer would be an ideal fit in Oklahoma City. The only problem for the Thunder is that they're most likely not getting him with a godfather offered based on draft picks. The top three teams in the draft in the Wizards, the Jazz, and the Grizzlies all have stockpiles of draft picks as it is, and they most likely wouldn't pass up on the chance to draft a franchise player even if the Thunder offers them 6 first-round picks. Well, the Chicago Bulls are more of a blank state at number 4, but Boozer will most likely be gone when they're picking, and even if he wasn't, it's just hard to imagine Chicago giving up on their pick when so little on their roster is actually settled. So realistically, I think if the Thunder are going to try and get into that top 4 range of the draft, they will have to include either J-Dub or Chet in a package deal, and that's almost a basic requirement. If OKC wants to acquire a future star, they will have to give up one of their young stars as well. Well, J-Dub has been injury-prone for almost a year now, but he's still OKC's second-best player who's still an all-NBA, all-defense caliber guy, while being one of the best two-way wings in the entire league. On the other hand, Chet Holmgren's stagnation as a scorer might have cost the Thunder the chip this year, but Chet's still the second-best big defender in the NBA, and even if he's still not quite the shooter his reputation suggests, for the Thunder, having anyone that big who can shoot and who can still get better offensively in the long run will still pose real problems for opposing teams. Well, the thing is, if some teams view either Chet or J-Dub as potential franchise players and are willing to compensate OKC with tons of draft picks to acquire either one this offseason, then the Thunder would almost have to listen, just because of the fact that ducking either player's max contract for a massive haul could make keeping the rest of the team financially viable. But then again, both J-Dub and Chet are still not even in their primes yet, and they were the second and third best players for OKC's championship team. So I don't think the Thunder are gonna give up either one this offseason just to acquire an unproven player up top the draft. So if it's not one of their max players, could the Thunder actually do something reminiscent of the James Harden trade wherein they would trade guys like Cason Wallace or AJ Mitchell to gain more financial flexibility or gain more assets for the future? Well, sure, it's unlikely either one of Mitchell or Wallace comes close to the MVP ceiling of James Harden, but what's for sure is that both of them are capable of doing more than what they get to do in OKC, which is why I'm not going to be surprised if other teams would be willing to throw a couple draft picks for the right to acquire either player this offseason. Also, if the Thunder feel the need to trade up in the draft outside of the top 4, then making one of Mitchell or Wallace the main piece of a trade package could work. But same as with Chet and Dub, I don't think OKC gives up on either player, at least not this offseason. AJ Mitchell very nearly led OKC in scoring in the Lakers series while showing real third option potential, and in the case of Cason Wallace, even though he doesn't really consistently post big offensive numbers, he had 5 20-point games in February when the Thunder were missing several players due to injury, which is proof of his offensive potential. On top of that, Wallace has already grown into one of the best defensive playmakers in the entire NBA. He led all players this season in terms of steals, on the way to him being named into the All-NBA Defense First Team. So I just don't expect either Cason or AJ to be included in any deal this offseason, especially considering both of them are the strongest contenders to join the starting lineup if ever the Thunder chooses to let Lu Dort go. But now, let's talk about what everyone's been talking about. Should the Thunder actually make a quote-unquote panic trade and just go all in for Giannis? Well, first off, the most immediate issue in terms of a Giannis trade for the Thunder is the money. Next season, Giannis is set to make $58.5 million, and of course, to match Giannis' salary in a trade, OKC will have to aggregate multiple contracts. And again, as we've talked about earlier, teams are not allowed to aggregate 2 or more salaries in a trade once they're in the second apron. And again, the Thunder are currently $39 million above the second apron. Therefore, between the trade itself and other moves, OKC would need to send out almost $98 million worth of salary to legally acquire Giannis this offseason. Well, sure, as we've talked about earlier, letting go of Dort, Wiggins, and Joe's contracts gives OKC a straightforward path to get under the second apron, and once that happens, hypothetically, the Thunder could put together a trade package consisting of at least one of Chet or J-Dub, maybe Cason Wallace, and probably Thomas Sorber, and looking at it, those guys' salaries should technically be able to match that of Giannis. But in addition to those players, the Thunder would probably still have to include first-round picks in the deal. So if you're the Thunder, would you really be willing to carry all that financial burden in addition to gutting your roster depth just to acquire Giannis? Well, sure, when healthy, Giannis is definitely a top 5 player, but then his health has been an issue for years now. In 2023 and 2024, he's missed significant playoff time due to calf and back injuries, and just this season, he's played a career-low 36 games due to knee and calf problems. Some would be willing to give up J-Dub for Giannis because of the assumption that J-Dub would be injury-prone for the rest of his career. But even if that was the case, why would OKC trade for another injury-prone player who's more expensive and is also 7 years older? Meanwhile, some would be in favor of trading Chet for Giannis, but then again, are you really gonna give up on Chet's long-term potential as a two-way big? And more so, would the Thunder really bet on messing up their floor spacing by having two non-shooting bigs in Giannis and Hartenstein in their starting lineup? All in all, I just don't see how a Giannis trade would make sense for the Thunder, and I also don't expect the Thunder to make any crazy risk in terms of roster building at least this offseason. Again, we gotta remember that this team almost made it back to the NBA Finals despite being handicapped, so who says a healthy version of this OKC team can't win another title next year? So if any, I expect OKC to just do the basic stuff like trying to let go of redundant players to potentially duck the second apron, trading some of their draft picks this year for either future picks or maybe for some solid role players to fill up their depth, and basically just building on continuity for another shot at winning the title next year. The bottom line is, right now, under the current CBA, the Thunder are no longer in a position to keep everyone from their championship core, which means whether it's moving off one of their huge contracts or gutting their bench, something's gotta give. It's hard to predict exactly what Sam Presti is gonna do, but we just gotta believe the Thunder's front office and how they never really make crappy decisions. And as a reminder, after that Game 7 loss in the conference finals, when Shai was asked about what he expects from the Thunder this offseason, he simply answered, quote-unquote, "I will give zero input. I will let Sam Presti, the greatest GM ever, do his job." So thank you guys if you've actually made it this far into the video, but what do you actually expect the OKC Thunder to do this offseason? Feel free to drop your thoughts in the comments section below, and again, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing as well. Again, this has been Real Balls, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.